Hello, everyone, and welcome. Our conversation today is the final installment of two overlapping speaker series. One is our series on rural transformations, hosted by the Duke Center for International Development and the Center on Modernity and Transition, or COMET. Rural Transformations is part of a broader project called Rural Development and the Capability to Stay, which is generously funded by the Social Science Research Council and COMET. Today's conversation is also the final event in the Reimagining the University series, sponsored by the Institute for Public Knowledge at NYU and the Committee on Global Thought at Columbia, along with COMET. My name is Kerilyn Schewel. I teach at the Duke Center for International Development at Duke University, and I'm co-director of the Duke Program on Climate-Related Migration.
And my name is Daniel Duhart. I'm a sociologist at the Nucleus for Research and Teaching on Environment and Society, NIDAS, at the Academia de Humanismo Cristiano University in Santiago. One goal of the Rural Development and the Capability to Stay project is to learn from alternative visions of rural transformation, those that defy mainstream models of capitalist, industrial development, and hold potential to enhance the livelihoods and future prospects of rural communities. In our search for these alternatives, the prevalence and possibilities of agroecological movements around the world stand out. Agroecology is an approach to agricultural change that recognizes it is no longer possible to look at food, livelihoods, health, culture, and the management of natural resources separately. Agroecology thus embraces systems thinking and holistic approaches to social transformation to address these complex and interdependent challenges facing rural communities. And of particular interest to our conversation today, agroecology both draws upon and generates local knowledge for rural transformation.
We are delighted to welcome two experts working in the field of agroecology and rural transformation. Miguel Altieri is professor of agroecology at the University of California, Berkeley. His numerous books include Agroecology, the Science of Sustainable Agriculture, and Agroecology, Science and Politics. We are also very happy to introduce Richa Kumar, associate professor of sociology and policy studies at the Indian Institute of Technology in Delhi. She's the author of Rethinking Revolutions, Soybean, Chupals, and the Changing Countryside in Central India. Miguel, Richa, a warm welcome to you both.
Thank you very much for the invitation.
So we'd like to begin our conversations to get to know our speakers and their personal histories better. So Miguel, can you share for our audience what is agroecology and what led you to focus your research and career on the science of sustainable agriculture?
Well, agriculture is basically the artificialization of nature by modifying ecosystems and transforming them into especially monoculture systems that dominate the landscapes of the world. We have 1.5 billion hectares of agriculture. 80% are monocultures of three crops, which is maize, wheat, and rice. So there's an extreme simplification of the ecosystem, and agroecology, what it tries to do is to design and regenerate agricultural systems based on ecological principles. And the idea is to develop systems that are going to be resilient, based on biodiversity, based on local knowledge, and that promote food sovereignty, socially just agriculture, culturally diverse agriculture, and also economically viable agriculture. And what it does, it breaks monoculture systems by incorporating technologies or practices that have been practiced by small farmers for centuries, like intercropping and agroforestry systems, livestock integration, soil management techniques based on organic management, and so on and so on. But at the same time, agroecology is a transformative science. It challenges the power structures that dominate the food system and tries to create a much more localized food system based on the solidarity between producers and consumers, and leading to local food systems that provide food sovereignty for everybody. What led me to this is that I was trained as an agronomist in Chile, based on the teachings of the Green Revolution. Actually, Latin America was distributed by the U.S. Universities after the Cuban Revolution, and Chile was dominated by the University of California. So more than 150 professors from the University of Chile and University of Catholic University went to the US to study with scholarships from the Ford Foundation. So they came back and they replicated the model of California. So after the military coup, I left Chile, like many others, and I ended up in Colombia, where I saw that farmers were intercropping, something that I have never seen in my education. So I saw immediately that there were deficiencies in my formation to understand the complexity of traditional farms and small farms in developing countries. And that kind of clicked to me that I needed something else in addition to the agronomy formation. Then I was trained in entomology as a PhD, and I was lucky to end up in Berkeley with a group of entomologists that were doing biological control of pests using alternatives to pesticides since the late 1800s. And I realized that pest problems are not the problem. It's insects, they are opportunistic organisms that when conditions favor them, then they exploit in populations. So I quickly understood that the problem was the system, the agricultural system, the monoculture system that deprives of natural enemies and other conditions for biological control, and that we needed to change that system into more diversified farming systems that provide opportunities for biodiversity and ecological functions. But then it was very quickly obvious to me that the dominant capitalist agricultural system dominated by corporations that were funding, including the university, were not going to be very open to that idea of developing an autonomous agriculture that didn't use pesticides. And so it hit me that science was also political in many ways. And that's how I started in agroecology.
Thank you very much. This is all very interesting. And Richa, as a social anthropologist, your work has centered around understanding the structural factors that shape the livelihoods and life prospects of India's farmers and rural citizens. What life experiences drew you to this sustained focus on rural communities?
So, well, a couple of decades ago, I actually got into the rural space in some senses by accident. This was the dot-com bubble and bust that happened around the year 2000. And I was part of a group of people trying to use computers to transform rural lives. And then this is, when you had those big computer monitors and you didn't have mobile phones and any of that, certainly not the kind of internet you see. And as we took these machines to villages in some parts of India, I realized that while technology may have had a role to play, possibly, one needed to understand rural life worlds and understand agrarian systems far better to see what technology can actually do in these spaces. And so then I ended up doing a PhD trying to understand the relationship of technology, agriculture, and broader transformations. This was the book that was mentioned earlier. In central India, I actually ended up studying soybean monocultures. Soybean is also one of those big crops that Professor Altieri also speaks about in terms of the whole feeding cattle and then feeding the meat transition, the nutrition transition towards more meat eating globally. And when I looked at, so I, as a social anthropologist, I stayed in a village in central India for an extended period of time, spent time with farmers, farm laborers, traders, processing companies across the soybean supply chain. I could see in practice what Professor Altieri said, the implications of monoculture farming for all of these different actors in the system. sort of the two large takeaways that stayed with me after finishing my PhD. One was the drastic implication of pesticides that already Professor Altieri has spoken about in terms of the toxicity, not only for human beings, but for the soil, for the environment. That was one very big takeaway, that we need to do something about this. And at this point of time, I'm not really familiar with agroecology, none of this stuff, just sort of coming from the field. I could, working with farm laborers and farmers who've been spraying, you could just, feel, I saw a prescription of many of these people who were sick and they didn't know what they were sick. What was the reason for them being sick? And there were really no solutions for these people. And the other big concern that I saw was nutrition, where diversity has gone from the farms. And so the diversity has also disappeared from people's diets. And so the levels of malnutrition and when I spoke to elderly people in these villages, people spoke about a whole vast range of foods that they ate. And now it was just rice and wheat and sugar, tea, ultra processed foods, which have become so common. And somewhere then I decided to try and work towards understanding in more detail this relationship between agriculture, health, and the environment, and the implications around nutrition, the implications around health. And that led me to agroecology and to Professor Altieri's work. And then over the last sort of now almost a decade or so, I've been trying to figure out in what ways. Much of my work has been documenting the problems related to monoculture farming, but in the last few years, I've also tried working with institutions and organizations, both to do research on alternative practices, but also to see how alternative practices in farming can be made a reality on the ground. And of course, the challenges are enormous, but it's really good to see in the last couple of years that the seeds of these alternatives have been sown in many parts in India, especially. And while the road ahead might be challenging, I think I see a lot of hope.
Thank you, Richa. So let's now turn to this question of local knowledge. Miguel, as you know, agroecology is knowledge intensive. It's highly sensitive to the local context, as you mentioned. What, in your opinion, counts as local knowledge, and how do agroecological approaches draw upon it? And how does knowledge generation within agroecology differ from so-called modern agriculture?
Well, basically, for agroecologists, studying traditional systems has been key for the development of the science. It is interesting that in Latin America and also in Asia and Africa, there are systems that have stood the test of time, complex farming systems based on deep knowledge of people about the environment, with their own classification systems of ethnobotanies, of soils, of animals, and so on, that had led to the development of appropriate technologies and complex farming systems that we as agroecologists have basically studied and derived lessons from. Basically, the contributions that we did as scientists to improve those systems were not significant. What was significant is that we derived lessons on how the systems have been able to withstand climate change through centuries, and how they have adapted to harsh conditions to produce without inputs, without the input of modern science, and that actually were very resilient and sustainable, and that actually were able to feed local populations in successful ways. So for me, for us, traditional knowledge is basically a complex of obviously culturally determined set of knowledge, set of practices that have been passed from generation to generation, from farmer families to farmer families, and that this has been very, very important for agroecologists, and that's why we say that agroecology is basically a science that is based on a dialogue of wisdoms. On the one side, you have the contributions of modern agricultural science, ecology, agricultural science, and social sciences, but then the traditional knowledge. And then from this dialogue, what emerges is a set of principles See, agroecology is not a set of practices or recommendations. It's basically a set of principles that guide the design and management of the new agricultural systems that we need to confront the polycrisis that humanity is facing. So to me, basically, that's what traditional knowledge for me is. And then on the how do we work with this knowledge? First of all, we don't intend to validate it. For example, if you go to the Andes, you ask a farmer, is this soil good? And the farmer will taste the soil. And then obviously, if you have a PhD in soil science, you're going to kind of react saying, what is this? You know, I was never taught at the University of California or whatever that you could classify soils based on taste or based on sound, for example. So if those people have, you know, managed those systems for centuries based on those taxonomies, then I'm not going to question that. The idea is how do we integrate that knowledge with the knowledge that we have, and that we do it through participatory approaches, in which basically our role as agroecologists is not to impose ideas, is basically to facilitate exchange of knowledge, to try to develop methodologies that are going to elicit curiosity and observation by farmers so that they can come up with their own solutions. So we develop very simple methodologies to, for example, assess the quality of the soil, or we assess the resiliency to climate change. And by doing that, the methodology is like, for example, you arrive at a farm and you say, if a hurricane comes, does your farm withstand the hurricane? And the farmer would say, oh yeah. And then you ask why? And then the farmer says, well, look, I'm surrounded by hedgerows that protect me from the wind. I have agroforestry systems, or if, you know, and so basically those are the indicators that we start working with in order to develop the methodology to assess whether this farm will be able to withstand, you know, climatic events of different sorts. So that's kind of it's a participatory approach, transdisciplinary, very respectful of the local knowledge, and enriching for both sides.
Thank you. Building on this, Richa, your work highlights the inadequacies of modern technocratic approaches to rural agriculture, but you also bring a critical eye to alternative approaches that prioritize so-called traditional knowledge. So based on what you're seeing in India, what concerns do you have about growing interest in drawing on traditional knowledge for rural transformation?
I'll respond to that by giving you two examples. The first is around gender, and the second one is around caste. Caste, which is another organizing principle within Indian society. So there's this year, 2023, is known as the International Year of Millets. And there is a lot of interest in now, especially in India, but also globally, in promoting various kinds of millets, both on farms as well as in terms of consumption. Now, the thing about millets is that processing them is very tedious. And the kinds of technologies that we have to process rice and wheat cannot be used in the same way with millets. You require different kinds of processing, especially if you want to retain the nutritive value of the grain. You don't want to completely take out the outer bran of these very, very tiny grains. Historically, the labor that was required to remove this bran from millets was done by women. It was entirely gendered labor. And a lot of this call for going back towards tradition and going back to the consumption of millets does not actually recognize this historically inequitous form of labor that was integral to ensuring millets are available, processed, and then cooked and provided as part of our food. So when we think of these, millets are now called Shri Ann, God's food. They're being rehabilitated in various ways, but these relationships also need to be recognized, and then they also need to be transformed, some of these very traditional power hierarchy-laden relationships. There is also a link of millets to caste. So several millet grains in the past have been associated and denigrated as food for animals and food for underprivileged caste groups in society. And so it was the elite who ate white polished rice and who ate polished wheat. And it was everybody else, the masses, who ate millets. And now, of course, millets are being rehabilitated as nutri-cereals. But a lot of the resistance towards millets has to do with their historical association with this kind of denigration. And the aspirations of a large majority of consumers are to eat the foods of the rich. It is to eat that white bread, which is, the modern bread, the modern kind of food, or it is nowadays, of course, it's to eat noodles and momos and pizzas and burgers. I mean, that's what the young children want. You go across pretty much to any rural center, north, south, east, west, children, and historically in rural areas, millet consumption was quite prominent even, 20 years ago. But now children don't want to eat millets. They want to eat all of this other stuff, which they see as part of this modern aspirational food. And so recognizing these caste gender linkages with some of our traditional practices is very, very important. Even as we try to rehabilitate them, we need to reimagine and rethink, as Professor Altieri said, how do we recreate practices that are socially just and that incorporate empowerment of marginalized groups as we take them on board in today's day and age.
Yeah, one thing that is important is not to romanticize traditional knowledge, because it has been eroded tremendously, and sometimes it's linked to, as Professor Kumar was saying, to certain social conditions that perhaps in the West we don't understand well, but it is important, however, that there are elements of that knowledge that are very fundamental, that are still persistent. There are microcosms of traditional agriculture worldwide, and that we need to preserve them. And there's actually an initiative by FAO called the Global Ingenious Agricultural Heritage Systems that tries to identify systems in which traditional knowledge and traditional systems and landscapes have stood the test of time, and try to preserve them in a dynamic conservation, not as a piece of museum, but basically certain elements that are fundamental need to be preserved. In Chile, in the south of Chile, there is an island called Chiloé, which has been declared a GIA site. And it's very interesting because it protects, for example, the island from the introduction of any transgenic material that is going to threaten the genetic basis of the potato systems, for example, in that island. It's like a UNESCO type of category where you cannot modify a church, or whatever structure. Well, the same thing here. So one of the characteristics of GIAs is the genetic diversity, the traditional genetic diversity. Well, you cannot introduce transgenic potatoes into that area because that would threaten the heritage. So it's kind of an interesting tool to defend some of these traditional systems that are being destroyed by the advances of agribusiness and capitalism.
If I can add just one more example to illustrate exactly what Professor Altieri is saying, India has a rich traditional heritage of water harvesting systems. We have various kinds of agroecological zones, if one can use that term, across the country, from desert ecosystems, drylands, floodplains, flooded tracts. And each of these places has their own set of technologies to harvest water. India, as you may be aware, is highly dependent on the monsoon for pretty much a bulk of its water requirements. And these systems were able to harness water and store it for very long periods of time and provide it for irrigation and various other purposes. Now, that knowledge is very, very critical, very important, and we need to bring that back on board. Yet, if we go back historically and understand how those systems were built and how those systems were maintained, it's very clear that specific caste groups were tasked with the job. I mean, this was occupational specialization to build these systems, but in many cases, they did not have the right of owning land and using the water from these systems for their own sustenance and their own maintenance. They were part of these very unequal power relationships with other privileged caste groups who actually had access to that water and to then drawing the resources within that specific region. So I completely agree that there are very, very important parts of traditional knowledge and practice that we must recover, and yet recognize those hierarchies of the past and make efforts to address them and redress them as we bring them on board today.
Yeah, thank you. This is connected very much with the question we had thought to continue this conversation, which you have a little bit addressed, but it would be good to deepen a bit. Like this, it is common to encounter a dichotomy between local and global knowledge, or between traditional and scientific. We have been talking a bit. This is a question for either or both of you. How might such dichotomies or tensions between local and global knowledge be addressed or even transcended?
Richa, you can start.
I think there is a role in place for both. Well, I wouldn't even say both, for multiple forms of knowledge and knowledge. I would include within knowledge the idea of practice. You know, we often think of this dichotomy between knowledge as in sort of theoretical knowledge and practice or work or action that's done with the hands. But whether one looks at science or whether one looks at traditional practices, knowledge ultimately is an integration of both action as well as theory associated with it. And I think rather than traditional and scientific, perhaps the terms local and global would be more preferable for me. If we think, for instance, about climate change, it's really, really essential for us to have global level data in terms of understanding the implications of what is happening to our climate through whether it's these satellites or these sensors and other kind of material and information that we are trying to understand. And yet at the same time, it's very important for us, if we want to deal with climate change, or even if we want to mitigate and address climate change, to understand local factors that are either contributing to greenhouse gas emissions or that are going to help us in adaptation. So for instance, you know, we may think that the principle of afforestation, you know, that's treated as a very good way of both mitigation and adaptation, actually. But while we may agree that afforestation is a great principle, what are the kinds of trees that we want to, plant in a particular region? What would be the use of those trees? I mean, are those trees the kinds of trees that we choose? Would they be providing fruit? Would they be providing shade? Would they be providing windbreakers? What would their ultimate purpose be? And most importantly, who gets to decide which of those purposes are important, and then who gets to own those trees, maintain those trees, work with those trees in the long run? So I think no matter what kind of problem that we look at, the set of solutions has to range from, you know, the local to the global, bringing in multiple forms of knowledge and practice, integrating all of that for figuring out, I would say, local optima in some senses. The standardized industrial solutions that we have deployed so far have basically tried to homogenize everything. And in the process, you know, they're making us run a race against nature. And nature keeps throwing different things at the industrial solution. The industrial solution keeps trying to run further and further ahead, whether it's pesticide resistance, weedicide resistance. You know, we had BT1, then BT2. So that's just, going on and on. But somewhere we have to go back to, it's in some ways, it's about humbling our own arrogance as human beings, that, we can know everything about the world. As scientists, we know exactly what's happening everywhere, and to understand and accept that there are multiple forms of knowledge as well as practice available out there. And we all need to work together to make our lives actually livable once again.
Yeah, well, I agree with many things that Richa said. I would like to take another angle. First of all, the hegemonic science that predominates in the universities and in the research centers all over the world, and has developed an agriculture that is already in trouble. Whereas traditional farming systems, as I said, have stood the test of time, and many of them have existed for centuries. And the idea of dominating nature comes from influences that started with Descartes when he developed his method, in which you cannot understand the whole, you need to understand by the system by its parts. And that's how modern agronomy and modern medicine and all modern science became atomistic, and everybody became specialized without having a systemic and holistic perspective. Then came Darwin, which was not well interpreted, because competition was the survival of the fittest was kind of the main message from that biology thinking, and forgetting that in nature there's more cooperation than competition. And then comes Malthus saying that the reason why we have hunger in the world is because populations are reproducing like rats, and therefore there is a gap between population growth that is exponential and food production, and we need to close that gap. And that's where the Green Revolution took advantage of that and said, look, what happens is that we need to bring technology from the west to the south in order for them to increase production and feed themselves. And that failed totally, obviously. And then comes von Liebig, who talked about the principles of it's called the in Spanish. I cannot think in English right now, but the law of the limiting factor. So there was always going to be a limiting factor. For example, there is lack of nitrogen, so we need to add nitrogen. Or there is a limiting factor, which is pests, so we need to apply pesticides, without understanding that nitrogen deficiency or pests are just a symptom of an ecological imbalance in the agricultural system, that you need to use ecological principles to put the system back in balance. So here we are. We have an agriculture that is totally dependent on external inputs, on petroleum, that is causing climate change because it produces more than 1/4 of the greenhouse emissions. That is causing 60% through deforestation and other processes, the loss of biodiversity, et cetera, and that's what we have. That's the inheritance of this agricultural progress. And on top of that, we have millions of people hungry, And so definitely, I think that agriculture is not sustainable, that I think that the modern Western science failed, and that we need a new paradigm. And that's where agroecology has taken such a force today. It's now, at the beginning, we were just a few that we were treated as communists and hippies or whatever. And then because they ignored us, they said that we were anti-scientific. Then after agroecology continued growing without the support of government, without support of universities, without the support of foundations, it continued growing as a social movement. And then they started attacking us, saying, well, you cannot feed the world with agroecology. You cannot, blah, blah, blah. And then now, big organizations like FAO and United Nations, other organizations, CGIAR, the international centers, universities that combated us and fought against us, are now embracing agroecology. But it's an agroecology that that leaves totally out the political and social dimensions of agroecology. So I think that there is no question that many solutions that we need today to solve the climate change adaptation, which is the agenda of the South, mitigation is the North. The North is producing, historically, United States, Europe were the historical producers of climate change. And then came China, then came India later on. And the South is the recipient of climate change. So the strategy in the South is adaptation. The North needs to cut the emissions, because if Colombia, for example, where I am right now, I'm farming here, went carbon neutral, it wouldn't make any impact because it produces 0.25% of the global emissions. Okay, so there's no doubt that the techniques and the practices and the systems that traditional farmers have used hold many of the solutions of the future. For example, the genetic diversity that they have, the complex farming systems, polycultures, agroforestry systems that are able to withstand, and we have many research projects that have shown that traditional systems after a hurricane or after a drought are able to survive, and we need to understand why. And the problem is that if we want to do that, that goes totally against the hegemonic model, which is based on genetics, because what's coming is on the one side here we're talking about agroecology, but the big bucks, the big research agenda that is coming is digital agriculture, is robotics, is CRISP, gene editing, so kind of a second, third generation of biotechnology, and all controlled by multinational corporations, obviously artificial intelligence, and all controlled by multinational corporations that are going to decide what technology farmers are going to be utilizing. And that's where agroecology comes in as a resistance to all that model that is going to be imposed on the world very quickly, in my opinion.
So you're both academics working in university settings. What kind of changes do you think need to happen within the university, whether in terms of pedagogy or research practice, to further some of these advances that you've mentioned, and particularly to realize a greater complementarity between local and global knowledge? It's a question for either of you. I'm not sure if one of you would like to start.
Well, I think universities, I mean, particularly my university, is totally divorced from reality. As a matter of fact, the Berkeley campus, where we have actually the Berkeley Food Institute that talks about food sovereignty and talks about, agroecology and so on, we're surrounded by homeless, poor people, hungry people, So if we are not able to solve the local problem in our community, that tells a lot about what can the university do about the world. And I see researchers that are highly intelligent people and producing a lot of papers, but they are caught, in that race, in that academic race of producing meta-analysis and sophisticated papers, because, that's basically the incentive for promotion. And I don't see that the university is responding to the needs of the people, where science is seen as that has a social function. I think that, and actually, I think that the universities, the land-grant universities betray the land-grant mission, in my opinion. And that I don't see that local knowledge is going to come in and influence the research agendas, maybe of a few groups within the university, but they're all kind of marginal groups, in my opinion. The main strategy is, at least in the universities that I know of, is biotechnology, is digital agriculture, is robotics, is artificial intelligence in agriculture, and so on and so on. Because actually the funding is increasingly coming from corporations. And so they are determining the research agenda of public universities, which are receiving less and less support from the states and from the public sector. And that's what determines the research agenda. So I don't see in the radar, at least in my university, as a dominant force in the radar, the incorporation of local knowledge, or how can we work with local communities. In order for that, we need to come down to the countryside and work directly. And for example, the Via Campesina, which is the largest peasant movement in the world, at least in Latin America, created its own universities called the YALAs, Institutos Agroecológicos Latinoamericanos. Why? Because the universities are not responding to their needs. So they created their own universities with their own methodologies, with their own pedagogies, so that actually what what the students learn can be applied in the local communities.
Richa, is there anything you'd like to add on this point?
I think I just want to emphasize again the question of funding of research. And in India in particular, it's also the American land grant university model that has been propagated as part of the broader Green Revolution shift that happened in agricultural research in the 1960s and 70s. And so there were two important shifts that took place from studying. We had several regional agricultural institutes scattered across the country. And from studying regional problems across multiple crops, we shifted to a very centralized research agenda that was set from New Delhi, effectively from the US, through that particular model. And very few select crops received a bulk of the funding for agricultural research. And so both the centralization as well as the narrowing of scope of research, we are seeing the consequences of that today. India, just in terms of, the implications of that, we are a, huge producer, exporter of, rice and wheat and sugar. But we've been importing pulses and oil seeds, which are such an important part of our diet. Even though India historically has been the largest producer and consumer of pulses, lentils across the world. And so there was a huge neglect of pulse crops, of oilseed crops, and many others within the agricultural research system. So in terms of, what would it take to transform this? I think I completely agree with Professor Altieri that actually there is a real disconnect between the research agendas of scientists in universities from the ground reality. So, at IIT Delhi, I remember there was a small symposium of scientists trying to figure out, what kinds of research questions would be interesting. And one of the projects proposed was to say that, okay, we've got now a more efficient method of pumping groundwater. And, India is suffering from a huge problem of over-utilization, over-extraction of groundwater. And that's sort of the last thing we need is more efficient extraction and better extraction. And then, to support more production of rice when we are already overproducing rice and growing it in regions where we shouldn't be growing it at all. So one of I think the most important consideration is to bring a whole variety of disciplines within the natural sciences and the social sciences together to start understanding what are the problems that need to be addressed to begin with. Many scientists are really clueless, agricultural scientists, about the broader ecosystem, agrarian or social, in which their so-called, research or innovation might find any kind of use. Beyond that, I think what I mentioned earlier, I will repeat that again. The scientific hubris that we have has to be broken somehow. And that has come, again, the legacy goes back to the colonial era in terms of this logic of improvement that was imposed on colonial populations, that, what the colonial scientific, sort of masters decided is what was better for people locally, rather than what the kinds of practices that people were doing locally. And that was even strengthened further after independence in India with the coming of the Green Revolution, with the privileging of this expert from outside, the scientist from outside. And so even if the scientist has never stepped into the field and has no idea about what's going on in the field, the scientist is still the privileged expert. A lot of it is linked to education, caste, class, gender, all of these dynamics in creating this, mode of the expert and everybody else sort of down below, the farmers who are supposed to be ignorant and backward anyway. That kind of relationship, that power hierarchy needs to be challenged, because only then will we be able to take seriously local knowledge, within the natural farming space in India. Professor Altieri told us earlier that, he does not ever, or his institute and his work has never tried to validate traditional knowledge. You take traditional knowledge and its methods of validation, its methods of understanding and obtaining data, whether through taste or sound, you take them at face value, because there are no equivalencies in terms of the scientific method, so-called, to actually validate that. But in India, a lot of the effort recently in the last few years within this alternative agricultural space has been how do we actually validate some of these practices using science? Because it's still about privileging the scientific gaze and scientific knowledge or the scientific method in trying to produce knowledge about the world and in trying to validate that knowledge about the world. So this power hierarchy is something that really deeply, fundamentally needs to be addressed. And of course, again, repeating, but to emphasize what Professor Altieri said about industry. The role of industry in shaping agricultural policy, in shaping agricultural science is more and more and more prominent. Of course, foundations, American foundations like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, for instance, has also been very, very fundamental in shaping research agendas. And there, many of these agendas are driven by industry-funded research. And, profitability concerns are far more important. There was an article very recently in the paper about greedflation. In the last 2-3 years, the profitability of various industries post-COVID has gone up 2, 3, 4 times, and that is not actually translated into benefits for either producers or consumers across supply chains. So where is this profitability coming from? A lot of it is about oligopolistic or monopolistic control over supply chains and markets, including over research agendas in terms of what possibilities are available for farmers, either in terms of seeds or inputs or other kinds of materials, as well as what kind of stuff they can in fact market. Many of the farmers say that, well, rice and wheat or some of these crops that we have a market for, which are again structured by various kinds of historical scenarios. So that's where we also need to address industry very seriously. How we do that, I think, is a very big challenge in front of us.
Yeah, absolutely. Richa, it'd be wonderful to hear even more about what you're seeing, what's happening in India. So you're the co-author of the 2020 State of Rural and Agrarian India report, which provides a comprehensive overview of the state of contemporary rural India and offers alternative ideas, paradigms, methodologies to address the entrenched challenges facing rural communities. So can you share with our audience, you've already touched upon this, but generally speaking, what is the present state of rural and agrarian India? And what are the main challenges farmers face? And what alternatives do you recommend in that report?
I think I'm assuming the viewers might be familiar with the huge farm protests that happened in 2020 and 2021. They made global headline news across many, many months. And they are a real symptom of the deep distress across rural India. Many people call them the tractor protests, in some senses sarcastically, because all of these farmers came on tractors. And the assumption being that if you're a farmer owning a tractor, then of course you're better off, you're well off, you're an elite farmer. Then what is there to complain about? Many of these farmers were also the farmers who were receiving a great deal and are still receiving a significant amount of subsidies from the government. So what is really going on? I mean, why are these farmers out here, surrounding Delhi and asking for some kind of change? Fundamentally, the problems of monoculture farming is what you see in these protests. Farmers growing monocultures, they're on a technological treadmill, input costs are higher and higher, output markets are not exactly working out year after year, and the rate of indebtedness of farmers in our country is very high, especially from the region of Punjab, where many of these farmers came. Punjab is one of the highest rates of indebtedness, and significant hotspot of suicides, farmer suicides in the country. In fact, it's very clear that the monoculture model of farming is only surviving because it is supported by huge amount of subsidy by the state. The inputs such as fertilizers are highly subsidized. The output, rice, wheat, sugarcane, in particular sugar, are all purchased by the state at minimum support prices. And that is what has pushed farmers predominantly to grow many of these crops in many parts of the country. In Punjab, like I said, rice is not agroecologically suitable to that region at all. And yet farmers are growing rice because the government is purchasing it and subsidizing it. It's also linked to the whole problem of air pollution within northern India, especially. Delhi has been an epicenter of that, with a great deal of stubble burning associated with the growing of rice in Punjab. So one of the problems clearly is I mean, the problem with monoculture farming is certainly a problem of livelihoods of farmers. They don't see remuneration within the system. And that is exacerbated by the ecological crisis that is being faced. So now with reducing groundwater tables, toxicity of the soil, declining soil fertility, on top of that climate change, we've had the last several years, we've wreaked havoc pretty much season after season, crop after crop that's suffering. You've had pest epidemics, you've had heat waves, you've had rain at the wrong time. All of these affecting crops in various kinds of ways. So in some senses, both the land as well as the farmer, the entire farming system is becoming unviable. And farmers see that they are at a point where they're all looking for some kind of change. Unfortunately, that change is very difficult, partly because the mainstream model is so highly subsidized and supported by the government and promoted by agricultural research, by industry. All of the new technologies Professor Altieri was saying, I'll add to that drones and sensors and blockchain, beyond gene editing and digital technologies. All of those are geared towards monoculture production practices. None of them, there's no research in trying to figure out how can we use these new technologies to actually enable diversity on the farm, to promote polyculture, to promote intercropping, to promote mixed cropping, to promote agroforestry. That imagination, that vision is not there as part of the agricultural research system. In terms of what are the alternatives? Where do we go from here? As Professor Altieri said in the beginning, not only is it important to consider agroecology as a broad umbrella in terms of agricultural practices, it's also important to figure out ways in which agroecological transformations can be socially just. So what we are seeing in India, over the last 20 years, there's been a budding organic movement in the country. There have been a lot of organic farmers. Many of them are, in fact, urban returnees who have gone back to rural areas. And so, these are privileged farmers who are, trying out new experiments on their lands. Some of them within these rural spaces are also people who've been suffering from a whole variety of health problems and now have turned to some kind of alternative out of compulsion. But mostly the farmers who have been able to do this come from a category where they have the resources and the wherewithal to manage the transition, as they say. And because the transition involves costs, there is this notion of sort of zero budget natural farming, but it's clearly not zero budget. You require investments, for example, in terms of inputs. You need to get seeds, you need to get organic matter back into your soil, you need biomass for that. Many of these things are no longer available. All the trees have been cut, much of the biomass has been burned. So access to some of these basic inputs is not available. And on the other side, in terms of the consumer angle, organic has been pitched as an elite consumption item. So it's very highly priced and it's only elite consumers who have access to this. So broadly, the organic revolution has been about sort of semi-elite, elite farmers and elite consumers working out local systems of exchange, or now there are, of course, several companies trying to work in this space. But if one thinks about the masses, if one thinks about the kinds of farmers that Professor Altieri is talking about, then clearly something different is required. And for the masses of farmers, it's their livelihood that really is most important. And livelihood concerns are linked very deeply to the kind of state support that's being given to monoculture farming. So unless and until that state support is either taken away and shifted towards alternative farming practices, it will be very, very difficult for farmers to transition away from what they are actually used to doing or what they are stuck doing in terms of the technological trend. I can, talk more, but I think it would be good to hear Professor Altieri's views on this.
I think in Latin America, it's the same situation. In the advance of agribusiness, monoculture for agro-export, the loss of biodiversity, the loss of food self-sufficiency, food security at the local level, et cetera, et cetera. But we have something that perhaps is not happening in the rest of the world. We have very strong rural peasant movements. like Via Campesina, like the Movimiento Sem Terra, the landless peasant movement in Brazil, and many, many other peasant organizations that are resisting the hegemonic model, and they are promoting alternatives. They are creating what we call lighthouses, spaces of hope, that perhaps the structure of the political and economic structure that dominates is not conducive to agroecology. At the local level, it crystallizes in experiences that are initiatives that are illuminating. That's why we call them lighthouses. And there's a whole movement, a pedagogic movement called Campesino Campesino, peasant to peasant, which is a pedagogic way of transmitting information in a horizontal way between farming communities and exchanges of ideas and practices and so on. And at the same time, a strong political movement that has led in some countries like Brazil to the creation of the national law of agroecology. And then that law, for example, that was stagnant during the Bolsonaro, but now comes alive again with Lula, it has very interesting programs. For example, one of them is the school school lunch program, where the governments at the municipality level buy from the local farmers 30% of their production to feed the children healthy food, which is going to translate in the future in savings in the health system and so on, but also takes farmers out of the competition from the market, which is totally biased against them. And and so there are institutional markets, social markets. There's also many initiatives where consumers and producers are getting together, in which the market economy is not the main rule, but is what we call economía solidaridad, solidarity economy, where there are transactions of money, but solidarity between the peasants and the consumers, which are also poor people. And so it's a way of democratizing the food system, where organic food or agroecologically produced food is within the reach of everybody and not just the elite. So I think that, just to summarize, I don't think that we can find the solutions to the agricultural crisis and the ecological crisis facing humanity in the toolbox of capitalism, because that's what created the problem. You know, Einstein said you cannot find the solutions with the same mentality that created the problems. So that's where agroecology comes in. And I think that agroecology, although it is a political movement, is not married to obsolete political positions of the left and the right, which are incapable today of facing the solutions for the problems of the polycrisis that we're facing. I think what humanity is facing now is a choice of between projects that are going to promote life and projects that are promote death. And agroecology is definitely promoting life.
Thank you very much. This has to do with also with a question we had a thought of about this, what you have mentioned as agroecology as a revolution, no, and the implications for the future for both Latin America as a region and also globally. But if you want to add more on this, you're more welcome. And but we also had another question here on agroecological approaches that prove to be more sustainable and productive than monocropping methods. Governments and international organizations have shown interest in scaling these approaches for their wider adoption. Yet, as they do so, it is common to selectively scale the science and farming practices of agroecology, leaving out the social and political change agroecology demands. So, Richa, can you share with our audience India's experience scaling natural farming strategies to promote agroecology-based farming? What do you see as the successes, failures, and lessons learned from that process? And if Miguel, you want to say anything more about this revolution you're speaking about, you're also very welcome.
So in the last few years, there have been several small, a motley group of farmers, civil society organizations, some state governments who are trying to figure out ways to seed transformation in different parts of the country. And they're all adopting different kinds of models broadly within the principles of agroecology. So the principles of diversity, the principles of trying to use native seeds, not transgenic seeds, the principles of ensuring, trying to basically work out nutritious food for local consumption rather than trying to build long supply chains. So it's sort of fairly different from the regular organic farming model or the historical organic farming model. Some of these experiments are, for instance, in the state of Andhra Pradesh, they are specifically trying to work with women farmers. So it's very clear that they want to incorporate the social aspect of these, of this transformation. It's not simply about working with anybody. There's a very clear focus on trying to work with women self-help groups and women farmers in bringing about this transformation. In other parts of the country, dryland regions, there has been a specific emphasis to work with dryland farmers in areas where typically there is only one crop grown in the season and then the rest of the year farmers migrate. So it's trying to, so this is government programs that are trying to work in the Bundelkhand region with small and marginal farmers to try and see how some of them can be grouped together in collectives to try and work some of these transformations. But of course, these are all very, very small experiments. Much research remains to be done. We need to see really how the transition can in fact take place. A lot of it is, 2 steps forward and 3 steps back, because again, the capacity of farmers to sustain the transition over a longer period of time is also very, very difficult. And there are 4 important challenges that are being seen within this space that need to be addressed in some manner or the other. The first one I already mentioned was inputs, getting adequate amount of biomass, whether it's animal dung, whether it's organic, biomass, or some kind of organic material to revive the soils. We have very, very low carbon content of our soils. And to bring that back in, efforts need to be made. And while there is some effort to try and bring back, integrated animal crop husbandry in some interesting ways, this is clearly a point of concern. Along with that, inputs related to seeds. So wherever people have tried some of these practices, getting traditional seed varieties has become a challenge because we have lost much of that biodiversity in the last 30, 40, 50 years. So that's the first challenge on the point of inputs. So even if farmers are committed, getting access to all of these inputs at the right time, working it out becomes a challenge. The second one is related directly to that, which is about labor. So the monoculture model has been about mechanization. It's, a lot of people say that, well, now all you need is to get a tractor. The number of days of farming are, 5 or 10, even if your season is 3 months long. When you get a tractor in the beginning, you get a tractor a few days in the middle, and then you get a tractor at the end and you're done with it. But of course, agroecology and natural farming cannot work that way. And the requirement of labor is much, much higher. And this is where some of the social challenges come to fore. Because on the one hand, if you speak to farmers, they say, well, labor is not available, labor is very expensive. How do we actually transition? The government needs to provide us subsidies or support. This is all too expensive for us to do. And on the other hand, India has a huge unemployment problem. We have a lot of labor, distress migration to cities. And so somewhere there is a very, I would say, a very important sort of cultural problem that we need to understand, which is, of course, again, linked partly to caste, to aspiration, where now working on the farm, working with your hands, working with animals is seen as demeaning and degrading. It's not the kind of work that young people want to do anymore. There was a famous saying in the last 20 years that nobody wants to marry their daughter to a farmer. Of course, that's very gendered because a large number of farmers in our country are now women. But the logic being that, you don't want your daughters to be working with gobar, with animal, with cow dung. You want them to have a different kind of a life. And young men certainly don't want to be on the farm. They don't want to labor on the farms. They want now, you can get a job in the mall as a security guard, or if you're slightly more educated in the call center. It's within this broader urban, peri-urban economy that people are looking for their aspirations. And so the challenge of labor is not simply a matter of, getting labor on the farm and an economic problem or a technical problem. It's a social, cultural problem that one needs to address as a society in terms of what we value. Do we value work with hands? And of course, work, it's not just work with hands. This philosopher farmer, Bharat Bhushan Tyagi ji, I've written a paper with him, which is sort of very interesting. Many of the principles that he comes from are the principles of agroecology. But he said, when you work every day, when you get up in the morning, you get up with your body having a certain amount of ability to labor. To make certain physical effort, and when you sleep at the end of the day, that it's finished. Every day you get up, you have a new ability to physically labor, and that is intrinsically linked to your good health. If you don't labor, you sit on the couch, you take the elevator, you do all the comforts and modern conveniences, then you lose your health. But somewhere for us, those modern conveniences and those aspirations are very much about what it means to be a developed, privileged society, and everybody is aspiring to that. And so this fundamental question of labor is linked to that. The third and the fourth challenges that we are facing, one is of course of markets as well as nutrition, in the sense that the monoculture model has been about longer supply chains and feeding urban markets. The challenge here is, how do we get livelihoods of farmers revived while helping them eat their own nutritious food and feed nutritious food to people within their own vicinity, not try and jump on these longer supply chains. Or even if we create somewhat regional supply chains, how can they be diverse supply chains, where if a farmer is growing small quantities of many things, then she can actually figure out markets and to be able to sell that, not that you need one truck of something to actually be able to sell it in the market. And the last, but I think most important bit is knowledge. It goes back to the theme of our seminar, that to transition, given climate change, given the kinds of degradations of the local environment, including the soil and the water and the pest situation that farmers face, even traditional knowledge is no longer relevant or useful. They cannot actually draw upon that arsenal. Of course, many young people have forgotten that traditional knowledge. But even if they remember it, things are so uncertain and so different and so complicated that if they try some things, they don't work. And that then discourages farmers. And so one needs a way to bring back innovative research on the farm itself. What you can do in dryland regions, you can't do in floodplain regions, you can't do in desert regions. And so that research has to be very localized. And that research needs to bring on both scientists as well as practitioners, civil society organizations, farmers themselves. Everybody sort of needs to come together to figure out what are our local models which are possible, what crops can actually grow and what combinations. What I did 50 years ago doesn't seem to be working anymore in the same way because things have changed, the conditions have changed today. So these are the four big challenges that we've been facing. Of course, I haven't brought in the stuff about the industry and other kinds of aspirations, which is also there. But this is at least from the production side.
Well, many of the things that are happening in India, I think, that are also relevant to the region of Latin America. The migration of young people. Actually, the system extracts labor from the rural areas by giving them false promises. And but it's interesting that during COVID, a lot of young people returned to the countryside and many stayed. And one of the objectives of the YALAs, these institutes of agroecology, is to train young people from the local communities, not only on agroecology, the technical aspects and so on, but the political dimensions, so that they understand why their parents are poor, why their parents don't have land. And that way have a political formation that is going to commit them to stay in their territories and promote food sovereignty and so on and so on. Now, the agroecological revolution in Latin America is basically a bottom-up is not challenging the big structures, although obviously there are groups that are trying to push, the governments to, like in Brazil, the national law of agroecology was a result of social movements pushing the governments for years and years and years. But it's much more at the grassroots level, and it's happening at the local level. And so a lot of people say, well, if agroecology is so good, why is it not expanded? Why is it not being scaled up? Because there's lock-ins. There's the corporations that are controlling the seeds and the fertilizers and the pesticides and the research agendas and so on and so on. And then you have governments, progressive governments, like here in Colombia, there's Petro right now for the first time, a leftist president. In Chile, a young guy, 36 years old, Boric, trying to promote change, but they're locked in. The big interests are basically blocking every reform that they want to do. So we cannot put all our coins in government initiatives. And what's happening is that there is a big movement that is creating a bypass. Here you have, the agri-food system controlled by corporations, and then here you can create a bypass by creating local markets, by creating lighthouses to illuminate other farmers, farmer-to-farmer initiatives, and so on and so on. And what is happening is that through this bypass, we see that agroecology is crystallizing at the local level. Whether the summation of all these local level initiatives that are successful are going to lead to global change, I have no idea. What I know is that at the local level, there are many initiatives that are promoting food sovereignty, conservation of biodiversity, and so on and so on. But then, on the other hand, we cannot put all the weight of the change of the food system on the farmers. We need to bring the consumers. We all consume every day. And consuming, we need to understand that food consumption is a political and ecological act. That every time that I support, the big supermarkets, of food supermarkets, I'm promoting a certain level, a certain way of farming, a certain structure of farming. But when I'm supporting small-scale farmers, local markets, and so on, I'm promoting resilience and sustainability in my communities. So I think that there is a big effort also that needs to happen in educating the consumers about where the food comes from and what it means to consume from small farmers that are local, that are cooling the planet, that are producing, without agrochemicals, that are producing nutritious and accessible food. And at the same time, we need to educate them on that they need to support local food systems and that they have to become politically active so that the governments at the local level, regional level, national level, whatever, support agroecology. And I think the message has to be broader than that, in the sense that it's not only that small farmers produce good food that is healthy, that is accessible, that is very important. But for example, there was a study in Southern California many years ago by some sociologists that showed that towns that were surrounded by small farmers had less violence, less drug addiction, less family problems than towns that were surrounded by big monoculture farms. In Brazil, they have shown that little towns in Sao Paulo state surrounded by small farms are 5 to 10 degrees cooler than farms that are surrounded by sugarcane plantations. So we need to understand that the agricultural matrix that surrounds the cities is fundamental for the social, ecological, economic, and cultural development and stability of the cities. And that's something that, agroecology can play a fundamental role in, on the one side, promoting agricultural systems that are sustainable, resilient, conserving biodiversity, producing healthy food, and so on. And on the other hand, a group of consumers that are solidarious, that are supporting those farmers because they see that not only do they produce food, but they produce many other social, ecological, and cultural services that are fundamental for the health of the communities.
Fascinating. Thank you. So as we get towards the end of our conversation, we wanted to raise some questions that came out of our last conversation in this series on the theme of religion and development. So we've talked a little bit about not just at the level of agriculture or the economy, but we've talked about the important social and political implications of this approach. Now we want to raise a question about the spiritual side of things. So, ideas about what constitutes progress and how it can be achieved, and collective efforts to this end are as numerous and diverse as humanity itself, and they form the part of the heritage of all nations and peoples of the world. And many would agree with the statement that for the development field to make meaningful progress, it will need to draw on the accumulated knowledge and wisdom of humanity in the moral domain. So in this light, Miguel, your colleague, Victor Toledo, has argued that there is an unrecognized link between agroecology and spirituality, and has suggested that integrating this aspect into agroecology would reinforce it as a socially and environmentally liberating activity. What's your perspective on this? You're still muted.
Absolutely. I agree with Victor Toledo, a good friend and colleague of mine, that, within traditional cosmovisions, spirituality is always linked to the concept of our Mother Earth, La Pachamama. I don't know in India how they call it, but farmers here, traditional farmers and peasants, offer their seeding and their harvest to Mother Earth, and they ask for permission to farm. And this Mother Earth concept also permeates into the indigenous peoples in the Andes, for example, in Ecuador, in Peru, in Bolivia, in parts of Colombia, to a concept of the buen vivir, the harmonious living, which is tied also, revolves around the existence of the Mother Earth concept. So definitely I see that, and Victor Toledo talks about that farmers have a praxis, a cosmos, and they have a theory, a practice, and a cosmos. And the cosmos, which is their belief system, the way they approach nature, is something that is lacking in modern science. We don't have a cosmos. If you talk about spirituality in modern science, they're going to kick you out as unscientific. And I see that dimension is fundamental. And I think that spiritual dimension needs to permeate all human beings in order to evolve to a level of consciousness that is going to allow us to understand that the change is not only technical, economic, social, but also spiritual. How do we engage with nature in a spiritual way is a fundamental path towards exiting or surviving the crisis that we're facing, or confronting the crisis. And I see one thing that is very interesting, that as farmers engage in a conversion to agroecology, when they start redesigning their systems, increasing the organic matter in the soil, bringing biodiversity with different crops, integrating animals and so on, there is a conversion of the system, an ecological conversion. But at the same time, there is a spiritual conversion of the farmers, where their relationship to nature changes fundamentally. And I think that dimension is something that we need to bring into the arena. Whether academia accepts that or not, it doesn't matter. What's important is the practice. And farmers today, at least many agroecological farmers that I know in Latin America and many countries, have that dimension. And when they transmit their knowledge to other farmers, they always bring that spiritual dimension, that we need to coexist with non-living humans, that we need to coexist with other forces like the wind, the water, the mountains, the sun, etc., the moon, etc. So I definitely agree with Victor Toledo, and the spiritual dimension is something that needs to, and is permeating, I think, the agroecological movement increasingly.
I completely agree with Professor Altieri, and most of the farmers who work in this space bring in a spiritual dimension in conversations. For them, it's, working with Mother Earth, Mother Nature. There is that sense of divinity and spirituality that's associated with it. And just to, add a little bit more to the comparison about, science and spirituality. This philosopher farmer that I spoke about, Bharat Bhushan Tyagi ji, he said to me that, science also has a place in this world. Science can tell you what needs to be done after, doing research and things like that. But science cannot tell you why you should do this in the world. What is the meaning of life? What is the purpose of, farming? Those are questions that are fundamental questions in any kind of activity that human beings do, the questions about the why. And those are questions that can only be answered through some kind of spiritual, religious connection to other human beings and to the land, to the earth. And in which is why one needs both of those threads of thought as we embark on these kinds of practices of working with the land. At the same time, I want to put in a caveat that in India in the last 20 years or so, there has also been a political exclusionism that has been associated with a certain kind of religiosity and certain kinds of sort of spiritual co-option in very political ways. So for instance, the zero budget natural farming movement that was there in certain parts of the country, one of the sort of principles of that movement was that only native Indian cows should be used, or the dung of only native Indian cows is actually good and useful, and a lot of that is also linked partly to certain practices, historical practices of revering the cow in very specific ways. And it's one thing to look at religious practices in their historical, local, cultural logic, but it's another thing to take some of those practices and then impose them homogeneously across other regions, across heterogeneous landscapes and different kinds of people and places. So, why is there no space for buffaloes or sheep dung or other kinds of goats, for example, in fertilizing the soil? Why does a certain kind of animal have to be privileged? And why do certain kinds of spiritual narratives have to be privileged over others? So even within the space of spirituality, there is a need to, I think, identify and be aware of the political narratives behind some of it, and think about inclusivity, think about incorporating heterogeneous narratives of spirituality. There's no one way of creating a connection with either Mother Earth or with nature or working with the land or working with fellow human beings. That relationality is fundamental, and we may all have different paths to achieve that kind of relation, to achieve that kind of harmony and spiritual relationship that we wish. There is no really one set path that all of us need to be forced to adopt.
Yeah, after 40 years of teaching agroecology and then farming now, I have many times knee before nature, because I thought I knew it all, and then nature decided that wasn't the way. So there is there's definitely, as you engage with nature every day, a way to get the messages and follow the natural laws. And I think it's very obvious farmers have done that for so many centuries. And I think that it is very important. There is science and there is intuition, and there is local knowledge. So I rely on those three as I farm here in Colombia, small farm. I bring my knowledge. I rely on the local knowledge of the people that have been farming there for many, many decades, but then also the intuition of trying to get what is nature trying to say through many different indicators, and then follow those indicators, because otherwise things don't work out. And I have been able to witness that in a very profound way.
Well, thank you very much, both of you, for these very insightful reflections. So to close, we would like to ask a big picture question we have asked of all of our speakers. As our world faces crisis after crisis, from climate change to rising global inequality, there is growing recognition that we need to rethink strategies for development in ways that are more environmentally sustainable, equitable, just, and participatory. There's also growing recognition that development is not just something that needs to happen in the so-called Global South, but true transformation requires changes in the essential relationships that underpin all societies. To close this third conversation of our Rural Transformation series, what final insights would each of you offer into how we need to reimagine development to meet the challenges of the 21st century? So, Richa, maybe would you like to go first?
I think if we want to think about the future, we actually first need to go back to the past. When we speak about the term development, it's not simply economics, it's not simply technical, although it's projected very much in that sense. It's very political, and it traces its roots back to colonial rule. And so when we, it's interestingly linked back to what Professor Altieri said in terms of, carbon emissions, greenhouse gas emissions. It's the colonizing countries that have the highest amount of emissions. And a lot of the wealth of the so-called first world has been built on the exploitation. In the United States, it's both slavery as well as taking over Native American lands and resources. In India, of course, it was colonial rule. Of course, colonial rule was administered in India by many of our own elite social groups. And so marginalized groups suffered doubly, not only from the white man, but also from their own upper caste so-called masters. The very idea and logic of development has a moral connotation where people in the so-called third world see themselves and feel themselves as backward. It's like, millets are only for animals or millets are only for underprivileged caste groups. And we want now, our aspiration is to be something different. And those moral images are very, very problematic and need to be challenged. So fundamentally, I think when we think about development, it's very important to move away from this apolitical sense of what development might be, that tied to the idea of growth, tied to the idea of wealth, and to think about these political moral connotations, which again requires a sense of reducing our arrogance about ourselves as a society. I would say it's not just elites in the United States, but elites in India too. Our own scientists, all of us in urban spaces living elite lives need to be rethinking our own relationships with nature, with the world around us. It is seen as very provocative across pretty much all fora, but the concept of degrowth, I think, is very, very important to bring into these conversations, where this so-called, our weddedness to the idea of growth, that growth is the only thing that's in fact going to ultimately bring development and get people out of poverty, doesn't look at these extractive relationships, whether colonial or post-colonial, where a lot of poverty is in fact been created through, as Professor Altieri was saying, by taking over rural lands, by destroying rural ecosystems, people are forced to migrate and then work in these factories at very low wages and live in these slums. So the very creation of poverty is masked by this narrative of development. The idea of degrowth, very briefly, of course, is not just about, producing only as much as we need, but it is also fundamentally about redistribution. It's about imagining a socially just society where it's not that everybody has a car and can move places. Today, when we count welfare and development in India, the more number of people having cars, the greater car ownership, the more developed we feel ourselves to be. But rather, is everybody able to go wherever they need to go using an economically appropriate or a means that is affordable to them? Are it's ultimately transportation of people that's most important rather than, so it's also about changing what we count as our measures of success. Are we going to continue to focus on land productivity or grain productivity? Can we change our measures of success in terms of farming to think about resource productivity? Are we using the least amount of energy? Are we using the least amount of water to produce the kind of food? Can we bring in nutritional variables? Can we think about food miles? I mean, there are many, many other kinds of measures of success as a society that we need to think and imagine, including, is a white collar job or a job that doesn't require me to work with my hands, that is better, as opposed to a job where I want to work with my hands and work with nature, that will perhaps be more meaningful for me in the longer run. So many of these are far deeper fundamental conversations that we need to have. And I'm glad that you guys have brought up this question.
You know, in Latin America, there are some very important authors like Gustavo Esteva, Arturo Escobar, and others that have challenged the concept of development. You know, they say that development is basically a tool of imperialism and colonialism to perpetuate a model of growth and development according to their agenda. I mean, development of what? You know, for what? With what? And what has been imposed is a Western view of development on societies that had other patterns of growth and development and engagement. So I think that that's an important discussion to have, because you see, as you were saying, Richa, in agroecology, sometimes they corner us to prove that agroecology works. Where's the evidence, they say, you know, in the big meetings. And first of all, they didn't put any money, like FAO, you know, IFAD, all these institutions. I've been in debates with them and they say, show me the evidence. And I say, well, did you put any money? Well, what kind of evidence do you want if you didn't fund any research? But despite that, there is evidence that their agroecology works. But then they want you to compare according to their indicators, like kilograms per hectare. Well, okay, what about kilograms per hectare per centimeter of water, or per unit of energy, or per unit of biodiversity loss, or per unit of nutrition, or whatever? You know, let's look at the real way of measuring success and measuring the impact of agroecology, because the others hide the externalities. You know, kilograms per hectare, yeah, but at what ecological and social and economic cost? Nobody measures that. You know, those are externalities that society has to pay, and so on and so on. So it seems to me that we need to be careful, at least in our group here in Latin America, we're very careful about not replicating the same terminology that is problematic. And that's why food sovereignty, you know, is a very, very strong concept that embraces a whole new paradigm of agricultural development, if you want to call it, in terms of reaching self-sufficiency, access to land, access to food, access to seeds, access to water, etc., all these important aspects, and autonomy. That's another major concept. You know, farmers, like Richa was saying, they're in debt. Well, agroecology takes them out of debt, because basically it reduces the cost of production in 40-50%. You see, the economic viability of agroecology doesn't come from that you sell your food more expensive in special markets. It's that farmers become autonomous and they reduce their cost of production in 50%. So I know farmers that have 1 hectare, 2 hectares of land that produce everything they eat for the family. That's a big savings. Second, they don't use external inputs at all, so that's another big saving. And third, the surplus they can sell at very reasonable prices in the local markets, and they make money, and they become autonomous. So what we need, and this is why agroecology is so attractive to social movements worldwide. First of all, agroecology is socially activating because it requires social organization. You see, social organization is the cultural milieu in which agroecology develops, and you need to organize farmers, and farmers are becoming organized. Second, is culturally acceptable because it doesn't question the traditional farmers, it tries to optimize their systems. And it doesn't question the knowledge, it doesn't try to validate it. It basically tries to optimize it by a participatory way together. It's also economically viable because it doesn't depend on external inputs, as I said. It uses local resources. And also, it helps farmers reach autonomy, food sovereignty, and more important than anything today is resilience to climate change. We see examples after all the hurricanes that happened in Cuba, in Haiti, in Puerto Rico, the diversified farms were the ones that withstood the impacts of these extreme events more than monocultures. The same with drought. The system that have more organic matter. 1% of organic matter that you increase in your soil, you increase the capacity of the soil of storing 17 liters of water per square meter. That's 170,000 liters of water per hectare, just by increasing organic matter with green manures, with compost, with rotations, with legumes, whatever techniques you want to use. So it seems to me that development, or whatever you want to call it, autonomy, food sovereignty, crystallizes at the local level. You see, the local level is the physical space where the social construction of the agroecological strategies is built. And by bringing a consensus through a participatory way of the local communities, the local actors to take action. And the role that we external people have is just to try to empower those people, to try to provide them with the information and the elements, facilitate the process of making decisions so that they, from the local level, can start the social construction of the alternatives.
Wonderful. What fantastic insights to close our conversation today. Thank you both. And so this concludes our final conversation in the Rural Transformation Speaker Series. A big thank you to our featured speakers, Professor Miguel Altieri and Professor Richa Kumar. We are so grateful for the time and the insights you shared with us today. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We're also grateful to the Center on Modernity and Transition and the Duke Center for International Development for co-hosting this seminar series, and the Social Science Research Council for supporting the Rural Development and the Capability to Stay project. And finally, we also want to thank the Institute for Public Knowledge at New York University and the Committee on Global Thought at Columbia University for sponsoring this event as part of the Reimagining the University series. Thank you to our audience members for tuning in. We hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you.